Some years ago, an organization called FAIR did the study that you're referring to, and every subsequent reference to this issue draws on that study. Nothing further was ever done. The essence of that study was that during the 1980s, that I had more Republican policymakers on the program than Democrats. And when they called me to ask me about this, I explained that yes, during the Reagan administration, if I wanted to talk to the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of Commerce or anyone who knew anything about government policy, that in point of fact, I would be talking to Republicans. Some years later, when the Clinton administration came in, you would have found exactly the reverse. I was talking to more Democrats than Republicans. That had nothing to do with the party, had to do with the people who had influence and who had control of policy making. And they were the ones that I thought I needed to be talking to and interrogating.
Nightline began as a special about the Iran hostage crisis.
Right.
That was, you could argue, the beginning of what we face today, 30 years later. Have journalists met the call? Have we lived up to the need to educate Americans about where we were then and where we are now?
No, and I would take issue, Larry, with your saying that was the beginning. You know, God knows where the beginning was. But for example, the Iranians would say maybe the beginning was in 1953, when they had a freely elected prime minister who, however, nationalized the oil and gas industry in Iran and therefore was overthrown with the help of MI6, the British intelligence agency, and the CIA. And he was replaced by the Shah. The Iranians have long memories, and they look back to that.
Well, we could talk about the Crusades as well.
We could talk about and believe me, a lot of people do. And one of the unfortunate slips of the tongue that President Bush made early on after 9/11 was to use the word crusade, which was immediately picked up in the Arab world. And they're saying, see, those Jews and Christians are coming after us again. So, you know, yes, history plays an important role. You know, I mean, George Santayana said those who ignore the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them. We're not good on history in this country. You know, history is what happened 10 minutes ago, maybe a day or two ago.
And I think that's my point. I mean, certainly you've covered everything from Vietnam forward. A book that was always very influential for me that I read when I was very young was Barbara Tuchman's The March of Folly. Do we just keep making the same mistakes? Do we ignore history?
We do. You know, for example, we are currently sort of agonizing over what to do in Somalia. Hundreds of thousands of people in danger of starving. Sometimes when people ask me, Ted, don't you worry about what the consequences are of stories that you do, I cite that as an example. George Bush, 41, the elder, sent U.S. Marines to Somalia during that period, just after he had lost the election to Bill Clinton, but before Clinton was inaugurated. And he sent the Marines to Somalia to deliver food. Hundreds of thousands of people had their lives changed. Those troops, the Marines, remained too long, however, and eventually they were drawn into some of these internecine battles that were going on. And to make a very long story short, what Americans remember is the book and the movie Black Hawk Down, in which a number of Americans were killed in one battle, and one ranger, a dead ranger, was dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. And Clinton pulled U.S. forces out of Somalia. 3 weeks later, the killing began in Rwanda. If the United States, and there was a carrier with Marines on board not far away, Marines could have been sent into Rwanda, could have stopped the killing early on. They were not. The United States did not become engaged because it was another African morass that we were afraid of getting into. Before the killing in Rwanda was over, 800,000 people died. It's sort of the law of unintended consequences. Even though we went into Somalia for the most humanitarian reasons, we ended up not taking action in Rwanda. And if you want to take that another step further, we became engaged in Libya because people who were ashamed of what we didn't do in Rwanda are now working for the Obama administration and convinced the president that he had to become engaged in Libya. Supporting, I should point out, people about whom we know very little, but what little we do know is that they were among the groups that sent the most volunteers to al-Qaeda in Iraq to fight against the United States. All these consequences. But, you know, foreign policy is complicated. And I think it's helpful for the American public to know some of these things. And that kind of coverage barely exists anymore.
I mean, your point about not...
I mean, let me just add to the programs that I mentioned before. Frontline on PBS
absolutely.
Does a brilliant job, absolutely first rate.
But day-to-day television coverage tends to fall into the superficial, the lack of history. How do you work that in? If we're talking a Nightline, it's one thing, or a Frontline, it's another. How do the networks deal with that kind of history in the minute 15 pieces on the evening news?
Well, they can't, and they don't.
Should they? I mean, should there be other outlets? How do you deal with it?
Look, I mean, the whole basis upon which broadcast licenses are issued is on the predicate that the airwaves belong to the American public. It's not just an infinite money-making opportunity for the businesses that get to use those airwaves. There are responsibilities that go with that opportunity to make the money. And the only responsibility that I think anyone should take really seriously here is the one that there is a responsibility to inform the American public about the important issues that are going on, to give them a little bit of advance knowledge. I mean, the first thing we knew about the Arab Spring was after it had begun. There was nobody in Tunisia or Egypt, your old stomping ground. There was nobody giving an early warning, a heads up, saying, you know, things are happening here. Times are different. Did we get any early warning on Syria? No. Did we get any early warning on what was happening in Libya? No. It's not just the intelligence agencies that should provide that, although they, parenthetically, are going through the same thing that the news organizations are going through. Everything is relying on electronic intelligence. Human intelligence has been degraded. They've called many of their human agents back home or let them go, just as we have called our foreign correspondents back home and let them go. Because it's expensive, it's time-consuming, and it's just a lot easier to focus on Charlie Sheen.
Could you do Nightline today, the old Nightline, given the fact that the foreign correspondents have been decimated?
Sure, you can still do it. You know, I mean, ironically, it's easier. What Nightline did, I mean, the great technological innovation of Nightline, which came about through an accident, was that I would be talking to a screen. And someone there, you know, I could be talking to one person in Tehran and another person in Moscow and another person in Washington, and sort of with these electronic threads, pulling it all together. That had never been done before, Nightline. The only reason we did it is that we were trying to get the chargé d'affaires of the Iranian embassy to come to our studio, and he said, if I leave the embassy, the FBI is going to arrest me. And we said, okay, we'll send a remote truck over. And we did the interview remotely. And Roone Arledge, then the president of ABC News, said, you know, that was terrific. You ought to do more of that. And we began doing that. Now every station in the country has the capacity to bring people in from all over the world. The technology is brilliant. the journalism has become degraded.
Gutenberg moment?
I'm sorry?
I said, is it a Gutenberg moment we're in now?
Well, I mean, a Gutenberg moment, I thought the Gutenberg moment was a good thing. I think what's
I'm saying,
yeah.
Is there opportunity?
There is opportunity. The problem is that we have now so democratized journalism. Again, sounds like a good thing. How can we be against democratizing journalism? Well, when everyone's walking around tweeting and Facebooking and doing all, texting, without any of the disciplines that really distinguish journalism from gossip. You and I, having worked for the networks many years ago, know that nothing that we reported went on the air without at least a couple of people checking what you were saying. And we had to work through producers and senior producers and executive producers and people on the desk. And the worst thing you could do in those days was to make a mistake and put that mistake on the air. If it got on the air, if that happened to you more than once or twice, you were gone. When people are just tweeting whatever they want to tweet, there are no consequences to getting it wrong. And the fact of the matter is, who's going to say it's right or wrong? There's nobody out there exercising any kind of judgment in that respect. We are confusing social media with media of journalism. Can Twitter be used as a medium of journalism? Of course it can. Is it used primarily as a medium of journalism? No, it's not. It's a means of saying, hey, guess who I just saw at the Starbucks, right? That's not journalism.
Do you have any hope that the audience will become media literate, to use that term, that they will ultimately separate the wheat from the chaff, and that will be the next phase of journalism?
Audience involvement is, certainly can be a good thing, to the extent that if the audience catches us, in other words, if the mistake gets on the air, and then it is an audience member who says, hey, Koppel, you got that absolutely wrong, here's why. Not only do I not have any problem with that, I think that's terrific. Again, though, I make my point, my mistake should not get on the air in the first place.
No, I mean, do you think the audience will get to a point where they recognize there's a difference between the New York Times and Susie's blog?
Oh, I think they know that. I think they know that. But I don't think people are stupid. I really don't. But, give most people a choice between their favorite dessert and some vegetable that is good for them that they don't really like. And if there is no immediate consequence to eating the favorite dessert, they'll go for the dessert. I think if you give people an option between watching some really heavy piece of journalism that is delivering information that they really need to know, or on the other hand, watching, Housewives of New Jersey, clearly, people vote with their remote control, and we see what they're doing.